All right. Welcome to episode 7 of my Just for Fun podcast. I'm currently checking the mic for this video begins because I'm really just trying to make sure it's recording. This podcast is about how I've learned how to podcast and what I've learned in podcasting. So, let's get into that. When I first started podcasting, I tried to buy a computer for podcasting so I could hook up a microphone to the computer, and that didn't work out very well because the computer was very cheap and it gave out very quickly. I learned from that experience that I'd like something very much separate than a computer, something that just records audio. So I was actually able to trade back in the poor working computer that broke almost immediately after I bought it for this recorder that you can see on my lap here. And it's doing quite a good job. I'm about a minute into this video here, and I'm pretty confident with my setup with the audio. One thing I've also learned too is in a recent episode, episode 6 that I filmed, the prior episode, I learned that holding the mic too close to my face and having the audio level on 10, like there's 0 to 10 on here on the audio mic. 0 is pretty much hushed, and 10 is like extremely nauseatingly loud to work with. So luckily it was me and my friend recording, so I basically just used his mic for my audio as well. And I gotta say, if you have a good setup and get your mics adjusted right and at a better level than 10, like you gotta lower it than 10 in my opinion when you're trying to work with a microphone, because you don't want it at maximum. If you have it at maximum, you're in for some troubles. I always find myself sometimes just kind of doing I'm always doing like a level of editing when I'm doing my podcasts. Like I know that some people probably do their podcasts and they just edit the audio and they say it's all good, and then, but I'd recommend that you just really look over your content and what you're making. And when you're done, or you feel like you've got like enough video and audio, cut down to the point where you hear it and you're not thinking to yourself, "Ooh, I don't like this part." That's dealt with. I found myself editing a hour-long video podcast that I did down to 27 minutes because I personally felt like the audio wasn't what I wanted it to be, or the visual wasn't what I wanted it to be. So I just found myself just kind of being like, hey, gotta watch it, basically. That's what I was doing. I mean, I was kind of down. That kind of reiterates my point about cutting down your content, making sure that, like, if you're doing podcasting, that you make sure that your content is edited, you know? Even if you're taking out just little bits, just make sure that what you're saying is what you want to say. That's basically it. That's the biggest thing I'd like to say before I get into my next segment, where I talk about the first ever attempt at podcasting that I have done for one of my YouTube channels called Storyboard Ed. Feel free to check out that. That's my main channel. Before I began to realize the equipment I needed, I actually used a cassette recorder to record the audio separately. for my podcast. And that was a terrible idea because cassettes are very old school, and the audio wasn't great, and the recorder itself was kind of skipping because it ran on tape, and it's no way to really get audio. And I had good footage, and so I just kind of went with the audio off of that for when I finished editing it down and stuff like that. And yes, it is on YouTube. I recommend it if you want to see it. It's on my paranormal channel, which I will show. Like, this video is going to end up with more screenshots and stuff on the screen than anything else that I have audio-wise. You know? Like, usually when I edit a video, I'm just worried about audio and cutting it down. This video, I'm going to actually have, you know, if you watch it visually, you can see, like, some of the points I'm talking about in this. But in trying to use the cassette, I had a transfer method where I put the cassette in and then I'd run it on the computer and then it'd convert via Audacity. That is a good tool to use if you're trying to convert cassette audio. I recommend. And there's something that you can get online for like really cheap, like $10 for converting cassettes. I'll show you an image of what I use. Yeah, for audio people and stuff, I recommend modernizing the tools that you use. Don't try to go old school with materials, because it's not going to benefit you at all to try to go old school. It's going to be a waste of your time. That's what I'm learning myself, is that I'm not trying to do things in a way that's old school. I realized that, like, as I was trying to do podcasting, I have a thing where I'm really into recording things in tape form. Like, I have a VHS-C tape recorder. I found it at I found it at a yard sale, and it was dusty, and it had all the charging ports, and also it had a VHS-C tape that I could start recording with. I put $20 down on it, and like, my folks are looking at me like, Edward, are you sure this thing's gonna work? I'm like, no idea, but we're at a yard sale, and this is the most interesting thing I see. And for me, when I go to a yard sale and I look around, there's just key things that if it pops into my interest, I'll risk it sometimes. I'll risk it. I mean, I'm not going to risk it like by saying like, oh, I'll put $100 down on it, but like, I'm saying I'll put some funds into it. Though I've been the idiot to buy an iPod for $1 and then wonder why the hell it doesn't work. So I've had those moments too. And I recommend that if you look into old tech at a yard sale, like if you see something, if you have a way of testing it then and there in some kind of way, do it. You know? Just to see if it functions and if it's worth paying even $1 for. But for me and stuff, I took the gamble without even testing sometimes. And I say if you got a chance to test something before taking the gamble, just test it, please. But yeah, so I have a tendency to try to use old materials, and that's not a good way to podcast. It's really not. Stating the obvious is get yourself basic materials that you need for podcasting. Like for me, this audio recorder here, I needed something that recorded clear audio, and I didn't think to look for something that just did that. I got a computer, and I thought that, hey, this computer, if I hook one of my other mics to it, it's going to do the job. Actually didn't even have a voice recording feature to it. Like literally, I plugged in the mic, it never registered, and I spent like a whole Saturday and Sunday doing that. And I have a video up on my YouTube channel where it kind of shows my start with podcasting and stuff like that, and it shows my frustration with that computer and how trash it was. I mean, that I just had it for like one day, and I was just using it for audio, and the whole thing freaking glitched out and gave up on me so quick. And I was so pissed. I'm really just trying to make this video work, for whatever it's worth. And I wanted to try to give a guide into podcasting for those who are interested in podcasting. Though, one thing I've learned about these kinds of recorders here that I've got right now is that they don't hold out the best. And I'm trying to learn how to use it better, but it'll eat up batteries quicker than quick. So I'm pretty sure there's a method to do better and not have it eat up my batteries quicker than anything else. In fact, I question if I'll be able to have a 30 or 40 minute length podcast because, quite frankly, it's down to 1 bar now as I'm recording this. So now on to other stuff. If I can cover it before it glitches out or stops. Other lessons I've learned from podcasting and kind of getting into it. I've learned that you got to have your patience. You got to be patient when doing a podcast. You can't try to race through a podcast. I've had it where I've tried to. I was so nervous because I hadn't really tried to do a podcast before, and I started talking really fast, and that's not a great way to do a podcast because, you want people to catch every word that you're saying. You don't want to race through the podcast. You want to take it gradually. And if you have a friend to do the podcast with where you can kind of have it be like a nice conversation, I think that's a great way to do a podcast is through conversation, to be honest with you. Because podcasts are, in a way, a conversation. You're either having it with your audience and they're not responding because you're talking to them, or you're, going over a topic with a peer or multiple people in a podcast. I've seen podcasts where they have about 6 people and they all try to get a word in. That's also, it's all about allowing people to speak too. I've seen podcasts where they'll be talking right over each other and not allowing certain members to speak. That's not a way to do a podcast. I see it as a way of an open invitation for everyone to say their point on the subject and be able to get their message across as clearly as possible. That is a great way to do things. That's the way I recommend it, is just give everybody their speaking room. And when they're done with their sentence, done with their speaking and stuff, calmly just kind of ease your way into it. Okay, now I'd like to interject, or I'd like to, get in there and try to talk about the subject too. Here's my point of view, kind of thing. Get your point in, I've seen ones that are trying to be controversial for the sake of being controversial as far as podcast goes, and I'm not trying to be like that. I don't want to be like that when I do a podcast. I want to talk about things that interest me. I just have it be a gradual conversation or just something to get off my mind. But I do not want to, throw something out there that I don't believe for the sake of views. I'm not doing this podcast for views. I know that when I first started YouTube, I do things for views that honestly were just cheesy. They were just pointless. And I don't want to do that. Be creative, I think, with podcast locations. If you can. Film different places. Film different areas. Make the most out of your space. That's something I really recommend for those who are, trying to podcast. I read a book, actually, on how to podcast, and I'm still doing it wrong. I'm still learning every day on how to do this and do it right. But I really want to do this the best I can. I really want to try to see what I can do with learning how to podcast. And that's what's been the main point of this video here is, this is me trying to get my point across the best I can. It's just make the most out of your environment. That's what you got to do, be creative. And as you can see, this building behind me, this was actually what my dogs spent time in. This is their little spot. I used to have a dog bed in here. But it was then set up for my podcast, but quite frankly, the camera that I'm filming with right now couldn't fit in there. Not very well and get any good angle that I could use for podcasting. So in considering your location too, just, make sure your space is wide enough to accommodate you and consider like others too, that like, let's just say you decided one episode you wanted a guest or something. Make sure that the space can cover that. That's one thing I've learned too, is just space. I feel like that matters too. I also got a spinning wheel for the podcast. I might use it at some point. I probably will. But basically it's like, I was going to write like options and then like say, spin the wheel, Johnny. And then like my guest would spin the wheel. And then like something funny would come across and then humor. I don't know. The Just for Fun podcast I'm doing now is really just experimenting and learning how to podcast in itself. But I am planning other kinds of podcasts where I kind of explore other things. This Just for Fun podcast is merely a learning how to podcast step by step by doing it, and then editing it. I've had some ones where anything could go wrong and everything went wrong with doing the podcast, basically. Like my first podcast that I ever did, that I used the cassette recorder on. Fart sounds, burps, the guest walking away and being distracted. There's no focus. And I'd like to think that there's a little bit more focus now with the Just for Fun podcast, but but it's definitely edited. I'll tell you that much. And yeah. It really kind of helps me kind of come out of my shell doing this podcasting deal, because I usually I'm a very quiet person. Thank you all for watching this podcast. Stay tuned for my next podcast, episode 8. My goal is to have 10 episodes in a season, and I'm nearing the end of my first season of the Just for Fun podcast. And I am eager